Listen, the pressure of the American immigrant experience in the 1920s was written into the ledger books of every tenement kitchen, from Mulberry Street to the docks of New Orleans, where the shame of poor food had to be transformed into a high-calorie art form to keep a family's dignity intact. There was a crushing weight to feeding a family of 8 on 15 cents in a crowded Brooklyn apartment, a reality that birthed the American version of pasta e fagioli, or what every mob household from Chicago to East Harlem called pasta fazool. This wasn't just a recipe. It was a high-stakes test of a woman's standing in the neighborhood. Ditalini pasta, mixed with cannellini beans, tomato, and enough garlic to ward off the devil himself, created a dense, high-calorie fuel that cost next to nothing but required absolute precision. Joe Bonanno would later write in his autobiography that his mother served this American staple every Tuesday and Friday for 40 years without variation. The pressure was in the timing. The beans had to be cooked separately and the pasta added only at the final moment, because if a mob wife served a bowl of mush, the word would spread through the American neighborhood in a day, damaging the family's social standing as surely as a lost bet. This resourcefulness was the backbone of the American working-class kitchen, where the high-calorie density of beans and starch provided the only protection against the biting winds of a Chicago winter, or the lean weeks when the American docks went quiet. That same Sicilian spirit of making something from nothing thrived in the American caponata, a sweet and sour eggplant relish that sat in large jars in every Sicilian-American household for weeks. In the stifling heat of a New York summer, this high-calorie blend of eggplant, celery, olives, and red wine vinegar was more than a side dish. It was a connection to a distant home, served on thick slices of American baked bread to men who lived their lives on a knife's edge. Salvatore Maranzano, the boss of bosses before his 1931 murder, reportedly ate this American-made caponata at every meal, claiming the sharp vinegar and rich oil kept his senses sharp for the American underworld's constant betrayals. Then there were the arancini, those fried rice balls the size of American baseballs, stuffed with ragu, peas, and melting mozzarella. In the social clubs of Elizabeth Street in 1926, these high-calorie heavyweights sold for $0.10 each and moved faster than the bakers could fry them. Making them was an all-day labor of love for American mothers, requiring the risotto to cool overnight and the meat sauce to simmer for 6 hours, creating a handheld meal that could sustain a man through a 12-hour card game or a long negotiation in a back room. As the Mafia climbed the American social ladder, the food moved from the desperate resourcefulness of the tenement to the high-priced luxury of the professional bakery. The sfogliatelle, those shell-shaped Neapolitan pastries with hundreds of crisp layers, became a symbol of American success. Ferrara Bakery on Grand Street, an American institution since 1892, supplied these marvels to nearly every major crime family in Manhattan. In 1925, a single pastry cost 15 cents, more than a full lunch at most American diners. This was the cost of respect. Al Capone famously had these high-calorie treats shipped on ice to Chicago by train once a month, insisting that the layers had to shatter upon the first bite, sending shards across the tablecloth. Even the simple act of drinking espresso and dipping almond biscotti became a ritual of American business pressure. In the back of Umberto's Clam House, a single nickel cup of thick black espresso could last an hour, because the real conversation, the life and death decisions of the American underworld, happened over those last dregs. If the boss poured your coffee first, you were in good standing in the American hierarchy. If you were forced to pour your own, the pressure in the room became suffocating, a silent signal that your time in the American sun was fading. Even the appetizers were fraught with the tension of the era's trade restrictions. Serving prosciutto di Parma wrapped around fresh cantaloupe was a dangerous luxury in 1927. Real imported prosciutto was technically illegal under certain American trade laws of the time, meaning the salty, high-calorie ham on an American wedding table in Brooklyn had likely been smuggled through the same Atlantic routes as illicit whiskey. At nearly $8 a pound, a full week's wages for an American factory worker, this dish was the ultimate proof that a family had conquered the American dream by operating entirely outside its laws. The spine of the American mob kitchen wasn't found in a cookbook, but in the cast-iron discipline of mothers who understood that high-calorie density was the only way to command respect at an American table. Take the chicken cacciatore, the hunter's chicken that was transplanted from the Old World to the crowded tenements of Manhattan and the South Side of Chicago. In an American kitchen circa 1924, a whole chicken cost about 60 cents, which meant this dish could feed 8 people for under $1, if you knew the tricks of the trade. It was a slow braised masterpiece, built in a heavy American skillet with tomatoes, mushrooms, and a heavy pour of red wine that filled the hallways with a scent of warmth and safety. Frank Costella's mother was said to have perfected the American cacciatore, making it so tender the meat surrendered at the mere sight of a fork, always served over high-calorie polenta or crusty American bread to ensure not a single drop of the sauce was wasted. This was the comfort food these men craved when they were far from their American neighborhoods, a taste of home that required the kind of patience that only comes from a lifetime of American labor. Then there was the eggplant parmigiana, which in the American Little Italies of the 1920s was less a side dish and more of a holy offering. The secret was a technique of cast iron discipline, salting the eggplant slices for hours to draw out the bitterness, a step many modern American cooks skip, but one that mob wives considered mandatory. These high-calorie layers of fried eggplant, bubbling mozzarella, and rich tomato sauce were baked in trays the size of an American newspaper. Albert Anastasia, the boss of Murder Incorporated, reportedly ordered this American-style eggplant at Patsy's in Manhattan the night before ordering 3 hits, proving that even the most violent men in the American underworld were governed by the laws of the kitchen. In the cold basements of Brooklyn and Chicago, the true smokehouse tricks of the American-Italian tradition were on full display with the curing of soppressata. This wasn't just sausage, it was a high-calorie currency, aged for 6 months in a cool basement room until it turned dark red and firm. Every American mob family guarded their ratio of black pepper, garlic, and wine like it was a federal secret, knowing that a bad batch of soppressata could damage a family's standing in the American neighborhood for years. The same dedication was required for bacala, the salted cod that arrived at American fishmongers on Mott Street as stiff, dried boards of lumber. To turn this into a high-calorie American feast, it had to be soaked for 3 days, with the water changed every few hours, a ritual of devotion to tradition that preceded the Feast of the Seven Fishes. In 1930, during the height of the Castellamarese War, the Maranzano faction sat down to a Christmas Eve dinner of bacala, while their rivals ate unaware of their impending fate, showing that in the American underworld, the rhythm of the kitchen never faltered, even when the streets were on fire. The American kitchen also birthed the veal parmigiana, a dish that many in the Old Country considered a bastardization, but which became a staple of the American mob hangout by 1925. Pounded thin enough to see through and fried to a high-calorie golden brown, it was served at places like Bamonte's in Brooklyn for 90 cents, nearly a day's pay for an average American worker, signaling that the man eating it had arrived. And nothing showed that success more than the braciole, thin slices of American beef or pork rolled around a high-calorie filling of breadcrumbs, pine nuts, and raisins, tied with butcher's twine and dropped into a pot of Sunday sauce to simmer for 6 hours. The discipline of the American Sunday gravy required that the sauce start at dawn, slowly transforming humble cuts of meat into something worth more than gold. This was the mechanical heart of the American underworld, the slow, patient assembly of high-calorie traditions that turned a tenement apartment into a fortress of American loyalty. The history of the American underworld is often a lopsided record, focusing on the men who fell in a hail of bullets, while the people who actually built the culture, the American mothers, the nameless street vendors, and the forgotten bakers of Little Italy, are erased from the official narrative. Take the infamous case of the lobster fra diavolo, the high-calorie dish that was on the table when Joe, the boss, Miseria, met his end in 1931. While the history books remember the hit and the legendary betrayal by Lucky Luciano at Nuova Villa Tamaro in Coney Island, they often forget the anonymous American cook who prepared that final meal. Masseria, a man who weighed over 300 pounds and understood the language of American excess better than anyone, had ordered a family-style portion of lobster simmered in a spicy, high-calorie tomato sauce spiked with chili flakes and white wine. In the middle of the Great Depression, that $4 plate of seafood was a defiant, high-calorie middle finger to the scarcity affecting the rest of America. Yet, the record only preserves the violence, not the craftsmanship of the kitchen. The same erasure happens with the Clams Casino, a genuine American invention born in Rhode Island that spread through the mob hangouts of the East Coast like a summer storm. These were the high-calorie finger foods of the American Social Club, designed to be eaten standing up around a pool table at Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street. While the record notes that Crazy Joey Gallo loved them, the credit belongs to the coastal American kitchens that blended briny Atlantic clams with smoky bacon and garlic, creating a high-calorie fusion that defined the American-Italian seaside experience. Even the sausage and peppers, the ubiquitous street food of the American festival, tells a story of forgotten economics. Since the first Feast of San Gennaro in 1926, nameless American soldiers worked the coal-fired carts, frying fennel sausages and bell peppers until they caramelized into a sweet, high-calorie tangle. We remember the names of the bosses who took a cut of every bun. Men like Ralph Capone, who reportedly ran a massive sausage operation in Chicago. But we erase the tireless American workers who spent 18 hours a day over the smoke feeding the neighborhood for 15 cents a sandwich. The memory of the Italian wedding soup, or minestra maritata, is perhaps the most hidden of all, preserved not in ledger books, but in the muscle memory of American children who sat around kitchen tables in East Harlem, rolling hundreds of tiny, high-calorie meatballs the size of marbles. This was the married soup, a union of meat and greens that served 20 people for 50 cents in 1925. Yet its true history lives in the grandmothers who used it to judge the character of a new bride. The calzone and the pizza, too, were once the poor man's handheld fuel, portable enough for an American crew on a job, before they were sanitized into the modern American diet. At Lombardi's on Spring Street, the first American pizzeria, the high-calorie, coal-fired crust was a survival food for the working class, long before Frank Costello started keeping a pie on his desk to calm his nerves before a congressional hearing. The record of the American mob is a list of crimes, but the memory of the American people is a list of these high-calorie, resourceful meals that provided a sense of belonging in a country that often wanted them gone. Even the ossobuco alla Milanese, with its high-calorie marrow and sharp gremolata, represents a moment where the American underworld tried to buy a more refined memory. By ordering a $2 veal shank in a Manhattan white tablecloth restaurant in 1928, men like Carlo Gambino were trying to erase their humble beginnings and replace them with a record of high-calorie, northern Italian sophistication, scooping out the marrow with precision, as if they were digging for a new identity on American soil. This same drive for status was found in the risotto alla Milanese, where the constant, high-calorie attention required to stir the saffron rice was used by men like Meyer Lansky as a metaphor for the discipline needed to run a successful American criminal enterprise. But perhaps the most enduring memory is that of the linguine with white clam sauce, a dish that Lucky Luciano ate in silence during his last night of freedom on American soil in 1946. It was a simple, high-calorie meal that tasted like the Atlantic waters of New York and San Francisco, a reminder that the record of a man's life is often just the sum of the American tables he sat at before the light went out. Even the memory of the zeppole, those high-calorie fried dough balls dusted with sugar at every American street festival since 1910, is a record of the neighborhood's silent hierarchy. While children lined up for a 10-cent bag of hot dough, the men running the carts were often American soldiers, learning the neighborhood politics that would define their futures, proving that in the American underworld, every high-calorie treat was a small act of loyalty in a world that remembered nothing else. The dessert table was the final stand for the American mob family's social status, where the Italian ricotta cheesecake reigned as a dense, high-calorie masterpiece that separated the real deals from the pretenders in the neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Manhattan. Unlike the lighter, cream cheese versions often found in American diners, the ricotta cheesecake of the 1920s was a savory custard of high-calorie intensity, flavored with lemon zest and candied orange peel, often sourced from American landmark bakeries like Veniero's Pasticceria on East 11th Street. In 1927, a whole cheesecake cost an American dollar, a luxury that most working-class families could only dream of. Yet, it appeared at every American-Italian christening and wedding as a silent testament to a family's reach within the underworld. Frank Costello's wife was whispered to have the finest recipe in the 5 families, a high-calorie secret that was more valuable than a tip on the horses. This wasn't just dessert, it was the final heavy note of an American evening, a high-calorie anchor that kept the men grounded in their American neighborhoods long after the coffee went cold and the deals were done. But the true soul of the American underworld was the Sunday gravy, a sacred, high-calorie ritual that turned every tenement kitchen from Mulberry Street to Chicago's North Side into a sanctuary of traditional American loyalty. This was a meal that began at dawn, with the scent of olive oil and garlic filling the American air before the church bells even rang. Every American mob mother built her gravy with high-calorie layers of pork ribs, sausages, meatballs, and brajol, all simmering in a massive pot of crushed San Marzano tomatoes for 6 to 8 hours until the meat surrendered its spirit to the sauce. In Joe Bonanno's memoir, he reflected on these American afternoons, noting that no serious business was ever conducted while the gravy was on the table. Sunday was for family, for peace, and for the high-calorie discipline that bound 3 generations together in a single American apartment. This was the one day the violence of the American streets stopped, replaced by the rhythmic clinking of forks against china and the slow, patient consumption of a high-calorie history that kept the past alive. Nested within that gravy were the meatballs, not the small varieties found in other cultures, but the high-calorie, tennis ball-sized giants of American Italian tradition. These were crafted from a high-calorie blend of beef, pork, and veal, held together by breadcrumbs soaked in milk, a trick every American mob kitchen used to ensure they stayed tender during the long simmer. At Rao's in East Harlem, which has stood as an American institution since 1896, these meatballs became the gold standard for the American underworld, costing 60 cents for a plate of 3 in 1929. Every American family had their own ratio, a secret passed down through the maternal line, ensuring that the high-calorie density of the meatball remained a signature of their American identity and social standing. Finally, we reach the undisputed king of the American-Italian table, the cannoli. Immortalized by the American silver screen, but born in the high-calorie reality of the 1920s, the cannoli was the pastry that closed every meal and marked every American peace treaty. The shell had to be fried to a crisp in an American bakery and filled at the last possible second with high-calorie, sweetened ricotta to prevent it from going soggy, a meticulous detail that American mobsters took very seriously. A dozen cannoli brought home in wax paper was the universal American language of peace, a high-calorie offering to a wife or a boss that signaled everything was right in the world. When Lucky Luciano was sent away from the United States in 1946, it was these American cannoli he missed most, claiming that nothing in the old country could match the high-calorie, gritty perfection of a pastry made on Mulberry Street. This countdown of the 30 foods that fueled the American underworld is a reminder that history isn't just made in courthouses or during the high-speed chases of the 1920s. It's made at the American table, one high-calorie, long-simmered meal at a time. These dishes were the daily language of a culture operating inside an American code older than the government itself. A world where a hand-rolled meatball or a jar of caponata was a small act of loyalty to an American life built from the ground up. While these episodes necessarily compress decades of American history into a few moments, the truth of these forgotten, high-calorie traditions remains as thick as the steam in a Brooklyn kitchen. Which of these traditional American dishes does your family still keep on the table today?